He came home from war expecting no one, no welcome, no banners, no soft words. Just a ghost of a town and a suitcase full of silence. But as he stepped through the overgrown alley behind the house that no longer felt like his, he heard it a faint scrape, a breath too soft to be wind. And there curled beneath a broken kennel was the last living soul who hadn't given up on him. Bailey's skin, clinging to bone, still wagged his tail at the sound of the man who had once promised, "I'll come back for you." Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The mountain wind in Silver Pines, Colorado, had a sharpness that seemed to scrape against the skin. Winter hadn't officially arrived, but the air carried a chill heavy with early frost. The sky stretched over the small town in a dull, slate-gray hue, and the streets were mostly empty, save for a few rustling leaves being pushed along the pavement. It was just past 5 in the evening, and the light had already begun to fade behind the ridges. Everything looked smaller, older, dusted with time. For Ethan Walker, the quiet was louder than he remembered. Ethan was 30 years old, with a lean, battle-hardened frame that no longer belonged to the wide-eyed teenager who once sprinted through these very streets. His dark blonde hair was cropped short, and a faint scar ran just under his right eye, a remnant from a rooftop ambush during his second month in Afghanistan. His eyes were a muted green, the kind that once lit up easily, but now seemed to carry the weight of things unsaid. There was a slight limp in his right leg, unnoticeable, unless you were looking for it, but it was there like the ghost of a memory etched into bone. He had arrived by bus carrying only a single duffel bag and a wheeled suitcase. No one had been waiting for him. He hadn't told anyone he was coming back. Not because he didn't have people, though most had scattered or faded away during his deployment, but because the version of him returning wasn't sure he could stomach the reunion. He didn't come back to be seen. He came back to remember what he'd once been. Ethan's destination wasn't a hotel or the town center. It was the old house on Pine Hollow Lane, the one with the peeling blue shutters and the sycamore tree that used to hold a tire swing. It had belonged to his grandparents, both long gone, and was the only place that had ever truly felt like home. But as he turned down the familiar alley that led to the backyard, his heart dropped. The house was there, but it wasn't home anymore. The porch light was gone. The windows were shuttered, some broken. The once vibrant garden had been swallowed by weeds, and the white fence that bordered the yard now leaned at crooked angles like old men struggling to stand. There were no cars in the driveway, no signs of life, just silence. Ethan stood in place for a long moment, breathing in the cold, metallic scent of November air. Then, with slow, heavy steps, he made his way to the side gate, the one that used to stick every summer and creaked like an old door in a haunted house. He reached for it, half expecting it to resist, as it always had, but the hinges were so rusted they didn't even groan. The gate fell open with a hollow thud. That was when he heard it. A sound, faint and broken. Not the whimper of pain exactly, but something weaker, an echo of longing, of recognition. He turned his head sharply, eyes scanning the overgrown backyard, and there tucked behind a collapsed wooden kennel lay a shadow of what used to be a dog. Bailey, a 6-year-old golden retriever once full of energy and warmth, now looked like a ghost of his former self. His fur, once a rich golden hue, was patchy matted with dirt and dried blood. His ribs jutted out from his side like fragile twigs. One of his hind legs twisted awkwardly beneath him. But what hurt Ethan most were the eyes. Pale, glassy, but unmistakably Bailey's. And they were looking straight at him. Bailey made a soft sound, tried to lift his head, but failed. Ethan dropped his bag and took a single step forward, then another. When the flashlight on his phone cut through the gloom, the beam landed on Bailey's collar, cracked and rusted, but still clinging to the shape of his nameplate. Bailey, it read. The moment seared into Ethan's chest like a hot brand. He knelt slowly, heart hammering in disbelief. Bailey. His voice cracked and something in the dog moved. With unimaginable effort, Bailey dragged himself forward an inch, then another, until his head rested gently against Ethan's boot. And then a miracle, his tail gave one feeble wag. Ethan's throat tightened as he reached out and cradled the dog into his arms. Bailey was too light, too still, but he was alive. "I told you I'd come back," Ethan whispered, pressing his cheek against the dog's dirty fur. "I came back, buddy. I'm here." As he lifted Bailey from the dirt and turned toward the gate, a faint movement caught his eye from the house next door. A tall, white-paneled colonial with wide windows and wind chimes that hadn't been touched in months. Behind one of those windows, a silhouette stood quietly watching. Lila Monroe, 28, lived alone with her aging father. She was tall, soft-featured with auburn hair, often pulled back into a messy bun. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, but always carried a shadow of worry. She worked as the town's only veterinarian, and spent most of her days at the small clinic on Main Street. Lila had always been known for her calm demeanor, her compassion, and her gentle way with animals. But beneath that calm was a history few in Silver Pines knew, the kind that carved quiet strength into a person. Her father, a wheelchair-bound Vietnam veteran, had grown bitter with age, and years of caring for him had taught Lila how to hide her own pain behind her purpose. As she peered through the frosted window and saw Ethan cradle the nearly lifeless dog in his arms, something in her stirred. She recognized him even after all these years. Ethan Walker, the young Marine who had once tended to her father after a seizure at a VA hospital out of town. A man she remembered not for his medals, but for how he had spoken softly to her father, not out of pity, but respect. She hadn't known he was from Silver Pines. She hadn't known he was coming back. But seeing him there, wrapped in sorrow and snowflakes, something in her heart shifted. She turned away before he could notice her. Outside, the cold bit harder now. Ethan walked down the street, Bailey in his arms, heading toward somewhere, anywhere that still had warmth left to give. The sky had turned a heavy shade of black by the time Ethan reached the town's small veterinary clinic, a squat brick building tucked between a shuttered laundromat and a weather-worn feed store on Aspen Drive. The neon sign above the door blinked faintly. Silver Pines Animal Care. Emergency line available 24/7. A battered bell chimed softly as Ethan pushed through the door, Bailey's limp body pressed tightly against his chest. The warmth inside hit him like a wave, laced with antiseptic cedar shavings and the faint trace of lavender, a calming scent used for anxious animals. Behind the front desk sat a slender woman with short brown hair tucked under a patterned beanie. Her name tag read Mara. She was in her early 40s with practical glasses and the kind of calm demeanor built through years of handling frightened owners and furious cats. Without a word, she took one look at Bailey and called through the intercom. Lila appeared within seconds, stepping into the lobby, still wearing her pale blue scrubs, a jacket tied around her waist, and a small smear of something dark along her wrist. Her auburn hair had fallen from its bun, and her tired eyes widened when she saw Ethan. It took her a moment to connect the figure before her with the memory from the window, and then another heartbeat to recognize the soldier who once calmed her father in a sterile, overlit hospital hallway years ago. She said nothing about the connection. "Get him in room 2, she said simply, holding the door open. Ethan followed without hesitation. Bailey hadn't stirred since the walk. His breathing was shallow. His warmth was fading. They laid him on the metal exam table. Lila's hands moved quickly, gently, scanning, probing, assessing. Severe malnutrition, she murmured. Possible pelvic fracture. Definitely a hip displacement. He's febrile. That leg looks infected. Her words grew quieter, more to herself than to Ethan. "Can you save him?" Ethan asked, voice rough. Lila paused. "I can try, but we'll need full imaging. IV fluids, blood work, broad-spectrum antibiotics. If the infection's in his bloodstream." She didn't finish. "It's going to be expensive," she said finally, "and long-term." Ethan pulled out his wallet, slipped free a battered debit card, and set it on the table. "Do whatever you have to. Every cent I've got from deployment's on that." Lila nodded, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her eyes. "Oh, then we start now." Bailey was moved to an intensive kennel room outfitted with heat lamps and a fluid station. Lila and Mara worked quickly inserting the IV, prepping an emergency X-ray. Ethan stayed in the lobby, unable to watch, staring blankly at a faded poster on the wall, encouraging pet adoption. His hands shook slightly. Not from fear, but exhaustion, adrenaline, and the crushing weight of helplessness. An hour later, Lila returned, wiping her hands with a cloth. "He's stable, for now." "He's in a bad way, Ethan, but I've seen worse come back." She hesitated, studying him. He knew you. That tail wag, it mattered. Ethan exhaled slowly and nodded. He waited. Lila didn't say anything to that. Instead, she reached for a clipboard, signed a few forms, then paused. "Do you have anywhere to go tonight?" Ethan hesitated. "I'll figure something out." "There's a cabin behind my father's property," she said, adjusting the stethoscope around her neck. "It's not much. 1 room. Used to be a studio for my mother's painting. Has a cot and a heater. You're welcome to stay there while Bailey's here." Ethan studied her, uncertain. "Why are you helping me?" Lila didn't answer right away. Then, as if brushing it off, she said, "Because someone once helped my father when no one else did. Let's call it a favor repaid." 15 minutes later, Ethan stood inside the small wooden cabin tucked beneath a cluster of aspens barely visible from the main house. The space smelled faintly of turpentine and cedar. A worn cot stood against one wall with a folded wool blanket neatly placed at its head. A small electric stove and kettle sat in the corner beside a tiny table. The heater buzzed, faintly glowing red at its core. He dropped his duffel on the floor, sat on the edge of the cot, and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at his hands. They were calloused, lined with grime and dried blood from Bailey's fur. He didn't cry. He never cried. But something in his chest ached so sharply it felt like breath might not come back. Meanwhile, back in the Monroe household, Lila entered through the mudroom and shrugged off her coat. Her father, Frank Monroe, was seated by the living room window in his wheelchair, blanket over his lap, a cup of chamomile tea resting on the side table. Frank was a former artillery sergeant, now in his 70s, his once formidable build thinned by time and paralysis. His face was weathered but sharp, and his voice always carried an edge of military brevity. "Long night?" he asked, glancing up. "Emergency case," Lila said, opening a cabinet to grab a box of tea. "Golden retriever, starved, broken hip, left to rot behind an empty house." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Owner Ethan Walker." The name sparked a flicker of recognition in Frank's eyes. Walker Ethan. He was a corpsman with the 5th. Treated me when I seized in Kandahar. Damn near kept me alive till the medevac. Lila paused at that, surprised. "Ah, you never told me." Frank shrugged, his tone softer than usual. "Didn't think he'd ever come back. Most like him don't." Later that evening, while looking for some old veterinary files in a dusty cabinet in the hallway, Lila found a yellowing envelope labeled in block handwriting to Ethan Walker, "In case you ever return." It was her father's writing. She sat on the stairwell holding the letter for a long time before deciding to read it. It was short, handwritten in thick, blocky script. Frank had penned it during his recovery, recounting how Ethan had stayed beside him on the sand, kept him talking through the pain, and refused to leave until a chopper arrived. "There's no medal for that," he had written, "but you damn well deserved one. If you ever make it home, I hope you find someone who waits for you the way you waited for me." By the time she folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket, her mind was made up. She wouldn't just help Ethan because he once helped her father. She'd help him because some loyalty deserved to be returned. The mornings in Silver Pines began slowly, like the town was unsure whether it wanted to wake up at all. Frost clung stubbornly to the window panes of the little cabin behind the Monroe house, casting pale reflections that stretched across the floor as the sun crept over the mountain ridge. Inside, Ethan sat cross-legged on a folded blanket near the electric heater, a saucepan of rice and shredded chicken simmering gently on the hot plate. The smell was modest, but comforting Bailey's favorite, or at least it had been once. Bailey, still gaunt but stronger than before, lay curled on a bed Ethan had made from towels, thick quilts, and an old flannel shirt. The once matted golden fur had begun to grow back in soft waves across his shoulders, though scars remained visible along his hip and left leg, a harsh reminder of the weeks spent alone behind that broken gate. When the dog shifted and raised his head at the scent, Ethan gave a faint smile. "Smells good, huh?" he murmured, stirring the pot. "We'll try with a little less broth today. See how your stomach does." Bailey's tail thumped once against the floor. It was slow, a little hesitant, but it was movement, and that was everything. Ethan had never been the kind of man to speak to animals like people before the war. But now, words often found their way to Bailey easier than to anyone else. There was no judgment in the dog's cloudy eyes, only quiet loyalty, like he understood pain, not in theory, but from lived experience. Later that morning, Lila arrived with a checkup kit and a small brown paper bag of supplements. She wore a puffy dark green vest over a navy thermal, her auburn hair pulled into a low ponytail. A few freckles danced across her cheeks, and despite the chill, her smile came easy when Bailey struggled up to greet her with a slow wag and a nuzzle to her leg. "You're a stubborn old guy," she said softly, kneeling beside him and checking his IV site with practiced hands. "But I like stubborn." Ethan watched from the stove. He stood on his own yesterday, just for a few seconds. Lila looked up, eyes bright. "That's incredible, Ethan. Seriously. His progress is faster than I expected." Ethan gave a slight nod but didn't say more. There were still days when words sat heavy on his tongue. After she finished, Lila handed him a folded flyer from the clinic. "There's a veteran support group meets Tuesday evenings in town. I think you should go. Just to sit in, no pressure." Ethan studied the paper. Bold letters read, "Silver Pines, Veterans Peer Circle, Healing Through Shared Silence and Story." He tucked it into his jacket pocket without a word. That afternoon, as clouds began to roll across the sky in soft gray layers, Lila invited Ethan to join her and her father at the park. "He likes the cold," she said, "and it might be good for Bailey to move around. Just a short walk. There's a bench near the path." Ethan agreed, though reluctantly. He hadn't been around more than a few people since coming home. The idea of being in public, even in a quiet town park, twisted something tight in his stomach. The park, called Willow Glen, sat on the edge of Silver Pines, nestled between a winding creek and a stretch of tall evergreens. The walking trail was paved but uneven, in places covered in damp leaves and pine needles. Lila pushed her father's wheelchair along the gravel with practiced ease. Frank Monroe wore a thick wool coat, a veteran's cap, and had a navy blanket tucked across his lap. He nodded once to Ethan in greeting his weathered face neutral. Bailey limped slowly beside them, head held low but curious. As they walked, Lila spoke softly, sometimes to Ethan, sometimes to her father, sometimes to Bailey. Her voice seemed to fill the silence without forcing it away. Midway down the path, Frank suddenly broke into a light chuckle. "He still thinks he's leading patrol," he said, gesturing toward Bailey, who was walking a step ahead. "Just like that medic of his." Ethan blinked. It was the first time he'd heard the man speak so freely. Lila looked at her father in mild surprise. "That's the first smile I've seen in 5 years." Frank shrugged. "First dog I've trusted since Nam." They reached the bench near the creek and sat in companionable quiet. Bailey lay beside Ethan's feet, and for the first time in what felt like years, Ethan didn't feel like a stranger in his own body. He watched the sunlight flicker through the trees and settle on the water in gold fragments. Over the next few days, a rhythm began to form. Mornings were for care, feeding, cleaning, medicating. Afternoons were for walking, however slow, however short. Evenings. Ethan sometimes found himself on the Monroe porch sharing a cup of weak coffee with Frank, while Bailey dozed in the grass nearby. And Tuesday evening came. Ethan stood outside the small hall where the veterans' peer circle was held. It looked like an old firehouse with chipped red paint and a sloping roof. Inside, a group of 6 men and 2 women sat in a loose circle of folding chairs. The man who greeted him at the door was in his 50s, broad-shouldered with steel gray hair and a prosthetic right hand. "Name's Chuck Rayner," he said, shaking Ethan's hand with his left. "You don't have to talk if you don't want. Just sit, listen, that's enough." Chuck had been an Air Force pararescue man, lost half his team and his hand in a failed evac. Now he ran this group not as a therapist, but as a survivor who had clawed his way back from the edge. Ethan didn't speak that night. But he listened. To stories about nightmares, addiction, healing. He watched the nods, the quiet understanding that passed between these strangers like currency. When he came back to the cabin, Bailey was waiting at the door, tail thumping faintly against the floor. Ethan sat beside him and said, almost to himself, "Maybe we'll go back next week." Bailey licked his palm in response. The early afternoon sun filtered through the pine branches in golden shafts, and for once the skies above Silver Pines were clear, an almost theatrical contrast to the last few stormy days. The town's modest park, Willow Glen, was dotted with families enjoying the unexpected warmth. Children in puffy jackets chased one another along the curved paths. A musician with a guitar strummed near the gazebo. Autumn leaves rustled gently underfoot, and the air smelled faintly of cider and wood smoke. Ethan sat quietly on a bench near the southern end of the park, Bailey at his feet, head resting on his paws. Though still lean and moving with stiffness, Bailey had regained much of his strength. His fur had begun to shimmer again under the sunlight, though scars still streaked across his flank like silent stories. Ethan, in a brown canvas jacket and worn jeans, looked more relaxed than he had in months. His posture wasn't guarded, his eyes weren't distant. There was a softness there now, something slowly healing. Nearby, Lila was setting up a makeshift animal awareness booth for the local shelter. Beside her stood a girl in her mid-20s named Grace Alvarez, a volunteer new to Silver Pines. Grace was petite, with expressive brown eyes, and long dark hair tied into a braid down her back. She had moved from Phoenix after leaving her job in corporate finance, searching for a quieter life. Grace was kind but quietly intense, with a strong sense of purpose and a deep love for animals, especially rescues. She had a soft voice and a habit of fidgeting with the strings of her hoodie when nervous. Lila had taken her under her wing, and the two worked seamlessly, pinning up signs and laying out brochures. Today's event was modest, just an info table and donation box, but it felt like something larger was in motion. On the far side of the playground, a young girl no older than 6 stood alone near the swings. Her coat was oversized navy blue, and she wore bright red mittens. Her name was Maddie Jenkins, and she had wandered away from her mother while chasing a squirrel. Maddie had wide green eyes, curly blonde hair, and a habit of talking to animals as if they could understand everything. Her innocence made her brave in all the wrong ways. Ethan noticed her first, not because she seemed lost, but because Bailey lifted his head slightly and gave a low, uncertain rumble in his throat. That's when Ethan turned and saw the dog. It was a large, muscular pit bull, pale gray eyes wild with panic. Its leash was still attached, but dragging behind it. The dog was not inherently aggressive, but terrified, driven by confusion and the loudness of the park. It had broken free from its owner, an elderly man named Walter Bingham, who was now frantically calling for it from the far end of the grass. Walter, in his 70s, wore thick bifocals and had a tremor in his hands that made him clumsy with knots and clasps. The moment had simply gotten away from him. The pit bull spotted Maddie just as she turned. Frozen, the girl stared as the dog locked on her ears, flat tail down, body low but fast. She didn't scream, just stood clutching her mittens to her chest, eyes wide. Chaos rippled through the park in a split second. People shouted. Grace dropped her clipboard. Walter began running. And before Ethan could rise, Bailey surged forward. It was not a graceful sprint. It was a gallop built on memory instinct and unrelenting love. Bailey's body moved awkwardly. His bad leg dragged slightly and his shoulder twisted with every step, but he did not stop. His bark cut through the noise like a blade. The two dogs collided just feet from Maddie. Bailey threw himself sideways, knocking the pit bull off course. The impact sent them both tumbling into the grass, a whirl of fur and force. The pit bull snapped wildly, but Bailey held his ground teeth bared, pressing forward with low guttural growls not to injure but to protect. Ethan was already running, shouting Bailey's name hard in his throat. By the time he reached them, Walter had made it too. Together they pulled the dogs apart. The pit bull, now trembling, was leashed and calmed quickly under Walter's frantic whispers. Bailey staggered backward, his chest heaving a cut, bleeding above his right eye. One paw barely touched the ground, his old injury reignited, but he remained upright. Maddie was safe. She had not moved an inch. When her mother finally reached her and swept her into her arms, the girl whispered, "The golden dog saved me." People had filmed the entire thing. Grace, in disbelief, held up her phone. Her hands were shaking. "I got it all," she murmured. Within hours, the video had been shared across town Facebook groups, the county news page, and then somehow regional news outlets. It showed everything: Bailey's charge, his body slamming into the other dog, his defense without brutality, the blood on his fur, and Ethan trembling, holding him afterward with a voice breaking through tears, "You did good, buddy. You did so good." The next day, a letter arrived at Lila's clinic from a regional animal welfare foundation. They had seen the video. They wanted to help. A grant was offered enough funding to open a rehabilitation center for neglected and abandoned animals in Silver Pines. The kind of place Bailey would have needed had Ethan not come home. Lila stood in her small office, the letter in her hands. She turned to Grace, eyes wide. "This is real," she whispered. "They want to fund us." "Of course they do," Grace replied. "Bailey earned it." Later that week, a separate letter came, this time addressed to Frank Monroe. A veteran-run wellness organization had also seen the video and wanted to honor his past service and ongoing resilience by inviting him to be an honorary advisor at their regional center for wounded soldiers. Frank, upon reading it, gave a grunt and folded the paper. Didn't expect that he said simply, but a flicker of pride lit his features as he patted Bailey gently on the head. But maybe the dog's not the only one who still has a few miles left in him. The cabin behind the Monroe house was no longer a cabin. Not truly. With the help of volunteers from the town, A few good-hearted local contractors and donations raised from the video that swept through every corner of the internet, the small structure had been renovated and expanded into a warm two-bedroom cottage nestled at the edge of the pine grove. It had whitewashed siding-deep eaves and a wraparound porch that caught the morning sun just right. It wasn't grand, it wasn't perfect, but it was home. Bailey now moved with strength in his gait, a slight hitch in his hind leg the only visible reminder of all he'd endured. His coat had grown in thick again, golden as wheat in August, and though a scar still cut above his right eye, it had become a badge more than a blemish. He had become a familiar figure in Silver Pines, often spotted sitting alertly outside the general store, or trotting alongside Ethan through the winding forest trails beyond town. Ethan had changed, too. He now stood a little taller, eyes, clearer voice, more certain. The quiet still lived in him, it probably always would, but it was no longer silence born of pain. It was peace, a kind of stillness that came from finally letting others in. The Ethan, who had once stepped off that bus with a suitcase and a weight no one could see, was not the same man who now woke each morning to the scent of pine and the soft sound of someone humming in the kitchen. That someone was Lila Monroe, whose world had also quietly transformed. She had become co-founder and director of the Bailey Center, the new rescue and rehabilitation facility built just 10 minutes outside town on a donated plot of land once used as an orchard. The center served abandoned animals and military veterans alike, pairing wounded hearts with loyal companions. Her father, Frank Monroe, now made weekly appearances as a mentor to recovering veterans, often sitting under the old apple trees with a coffee thermos and a cane carved from oak. The program had brought new faces to town. One of them was Derek Shaw, a former Marine canine handler who had lost both his working dog and 2 of his teammates in a bombing near Fallujah. Derek, in his late 30s, tall and wiry, with sandy hair and tired blue eyes, had been among the first to sign up when he heard about the Bailey Center. He was guarded prone to silence and skeptical of anything that promised healing. But the first time he saw Bailey walk beside Ethan, calm, proud, unshaken, something inside him softened. He asked if he could volunteer. Ethan had been offered a formal position soon after. Not as a groundskeeper or aide, but as the head trainer for therapeutic dog programs designed to support PTSD recovery. The idea had come from Chuck Rayner, the man who ran the Veterans Peer Circle and who had since become a kind of big brother to Ethan. Chuck believed in service that continued long after uniforms came off. "You're not just good with dogs," Ethan Chuck had said, leaning back in a metal chair on the center's porch one late morning. "You're good because you listen like they do, patient, present. That's rarer than people think." And so Ethan began teaching again, not just obedience, but trust-response bonding. Bailey was always at his side demonstrating techniques, sensing shifts in the veteran's energy, laying his head gently on the lap of someone who hadn't spoken in days. In the quietest ways, Bailey reminded people they were not alone. By December, Ethan, Lila, and Bailey officially moved into the new house. The town had gathered for the occasion. Grace Alvarez brought homemade blueberry pie. Walter Bingham, the elderly man whose runaway dog had triggered Bailey's heroic rescue, donated a custom-built doghouse, though Bailey preferred sleeping at the foot of Ethan and Lila's bed. Even Maddie Jenkins, the little girl who had been saved that day in the park, arrived with her mother and a hand-drawn card that said, in crayon, "Thank you for being brave." That night, snow began to fall for the first time that season. It dusted the rooftops and gathered along the fence posts in soft clumps. From the porch, everything looked still, like the world had paused just long enough to breathe. Ethan sat in a wooden rocking chair near the front steps, a flannel blanket draped across his lap. Bailey lay beside him, head resting near his boot, breathing slow and steady. His tail twitched occasionally in sleep, perhaps chasing a dream only dogs understood. Inside, Lila moved around the kitchen. The glow from the window spilled out onto the porch, and the clink of mugs and kettle rising to a boil made a melody Ethan had come to love. She hummed a tune he didn't recognize, maybe something her mother used to sing, and the sound curled around the house like warmth. He reached down, resting a hand on Bailey's back. The dog's fur was warm beneath his palm, and as if sensing the moment, Bailey opened one eye and gave a small grunt before closing it again. They had all come back in one way or another, not just from war or loneliness, but from the edge of what could have been lost forever. They had come back because someone waited, because someone believed, because one golden dog had not given up on hope even when hope had long since gone quiet. And now they didn't just survive, they lived together. Sometimes miracles don't come in blinding lights or thunderous voices. They arrive quietly on four legs with a wagging tail and eyes that still believe in you, even when you've stopped believing in yourself. Bailey's journey is a reminder that God often uses the most unexpected messengers to heal our wounds and lead us home not with words, but with loyalty, love, and unwavering presence. In a world where so many are hurting in silence, the greatest miracle may simply be someone who stays, someone who waits, someone who walks beside you until you're ready to stand again. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share it with someone who needs a reminder that redemption is real, that second chances are possible, and that sometimes God's grace comes with pause. Comment below if you believe in the power of healing. Type Amen if you know someone, or if you are someone who needed a story like this today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and help us spread more stories of hope and love. May God bless you, your home, and every soul still learning to return.